Hello, and welcome now. This time as we come to look at the scripture readings assigned for the 15th Sunday of the time of the year. The readings this time are, first of all, from the prophet Isaiah from chapter 55, verses 10 and 11, just two verses. From the letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 18 through 23, and from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 1 through 23. Now, what we will be listening to over the next few weeks, 3 weeks actually, are what we call parables that Matthew includes in his gospel story. Now, the parable that we hear, or the section that we hear this time, verses 1 through 23, can be divided into 3 sections. The first section, verses 1 through 9, give the parable proper. Verses 10 through 17 include a discussion about Jesus' reason for speaking in parables. And then in verses 18 through 23, we get a secondary interpretation of the parable. So I give this as a little bit of introduction as to how this works out and why it's included in Matthew. Remember, Matthew's gospel pictures Jesus as a teacher, therefore carrying on the role that most regularly was assigned also to the great Moses as a teacher of the people. Jesus here pictured as a teacher. Now, the story itself, the parable itself, let's begin there, perhaps is familiar. It's also found in other Gospels. Picture of the sower who goes out to sow seed. And one might, and here's where we're concerned about who the original audience might be a group called the peasant farmers. This, we suspect, might have been the original audience to which this parable was addressed, and therefore they would have appreciated and got the sense in which things would be done. Remember that the sower sows the seed. Some falls on hard ground, some falls on good ground, but it's caught up by thickets, by weeds. Some grows quickly but dries out, and then some is soil found on good soil. So that's basically the gist of the throwing of the seed. We have mentioned before that seed, now here's where 2 understandings might be, is sown, if sown or thrown just like this, any old place and wherever it falls. We hope that something happens. The be one way in which this would be interpreted. But on the other hand, remember that seed was not something you went to the local market or store to buy a packet of seeds. Seeds were very valuable. And so you might not just scatter them any old place, but would be very careful where you place them. Now, if the question is, who is the sower of this seed? If it's the tenant, that is, the man who owns the property, would he be the one who throws the seed like this? If the sower of the seed were the workers who worked on the property, would they not have been more careful in how the seeds were scattered? So again, what we're kind of reflecting on a little bit is who exactly was or is the sower of the seed. Because if the sower of the seed is the owner, but he doesn't actually do it, you can see where those who work the field kind of sit and smile, saying, here's a guy who thinks he knows what he's doing when it comes to planting the seed, but he really doesn't seem to know too well, because when you throw it on certain ground and it doesn't catch, remember, the first falls on hard ground and the birds of the air come and take it, and thus it is gone. If you sow it on dry land and it's not, and etc., you see, if you were someone who actually worked the field or were paying for things, you would be much more careful where the seed fell. So, who is the sower? And that's where some of the emphasis on this parable might go. In fact, those who interpret this parable say that there are 4 possible ways of kind of looking at the importance of where the seed is sown. Should we call this the parable of the sower? Should we call this the parable of the seed? Should we call this the parable of the soil? Should we call this the parable of the harvest? So you can see how each of these play into an interpretation or an understanding of the meaning of the parable. If the parable is about the sower, well, then that's where we place the emphasis. If it's about the seed, then we watch what happens to the seed in each of the 4 places where it lands. If we take it's the parable of the soil, then we examine the soil in each of the 4 places in which the seed falls. And if it's the parable of the harvest, then we're concerned with the net result of the crop when it comes to bloom. So you can see the parable has a variety of approaches that could have been taken as Jesus presents it. We're not quite sure, and what we believe is that this is perhaps an original parable of Jesus. One remembers that parables were a traditional way of teaching that teachers often used, not only in the first century world, although we have a number of parables outside of the gospel tradition itself where others used this form. And one of the qualities, we've gone through this, I think, before in examining how parables are understood, but one of the qualities of a good parable is that it's open-ended. One doesn't really know. It raises, what I mean by open-ended, it raises more a question than it gives an answer. Although in this parable, there is an answer given. Now, the ultimate goodness of the seed is that it falls on good soil. Notice how we need to put all these, as I mentioned, there are 4 different ways you could analyze this, but we've got to put it all together. But what is interesting and what makes this parable perhaps one of the most original, we believe, that is attributed and used by Jesus, is that when it falls on good soil, and here's the way in which Matthew presents this, the result is 100-fold or 60 or 30. Now, this, by the way, is the reverse order than Luke uses, where he goes the other way around, 30, 60, and 100. He kind of leads you to an amazing conclusion. Now, why would we say amazing? Because in a seed soiled good, generally would produce at best, for every seed, at best 7 out of every 100 that would be sowed. So the fact that you starts with 100 producing 100 is amazing, okay? And that certainly would have caught the attention of those who heard this. And if 100 is more, well, then 60 is still amazing. And even 30 is still amazing given the normal growth that takes place there. So, and again, what is the ground that this has been sown on? The footpath, which therefore is hard, rocky ground where there is some moisture, but when it grows up, doesn't have enough moisture to last. Among thorns, well, certainly in a thorn area, they both grow up, the seed and the thorns, but the thorns, being the stronger, last longer and therefore will triumph over the grain. And then, of course, the overflowing of the good soil, which is the fourth. So spend all of that time kind of saying that, well, if it produces, as it does, the 100 or the 60 or the 30, you can see that here the owner is now praised, okay? And the tenants are kind of, wow, where'd this guy get this information about this? However, if it doesn't work this way and if the wastefulness doesn't work. Now, what does Jesus have in mind in telling this parable originally? Well, we believe that the interpretation here would be this is the way in which God sows God's goodness, not kind of isolating it to a particular space or a time, but rather with great generosity. All right, so that would be the original parable. Now, what follows next in verses 16, 10 through 17, is why Jesus is pictured as teaching in parables. Now, the disciples ask this question. Sometimes the way in which parables have been often interpreted is people don't get it. Well, that's really not true. People do get, and the contemporaries of Jesus would have got the meaning of the parables. But why does Jesus teach in parables? And that's interesting, why this discussion, and we will see, goes on between Jesus and his disciples. Here, parables are considered to be an inside language. So now we have this question of the outsider or the insider. The inner groups were always those who could interpret with one another what the meaning of something was. So the inner group here would be the disciples of Jesus, the disciples earlier on of John the Baptist, Herodians, Sadducees, Pharisees, among others. All were inner groups, and when they told their stories, those within it understood what the meaning of the message was. Now, is Jesus teaching here, and again this discussion goes on between Jesus and his disciples, to include outsiders, that is the entire house of Israel? This would include territories known as Judea, Perea, Galilee, namely the whole house of Israel, or all of those who in Jesus' time had some allegiance to the Jerusalem temple. So all of this is a kind of background that we perhaps would not be all too excited about, but which apparently were concerns of Jesus' time. All right, and that's where Jesus explains a little bit why he uses parables. Now let us go to the second interpretation, which would be found in verses 18 through 23. By the way, in verse 16 and 17, we find what we call a beatitude, which could also be found, we've mentioned this before, in the so-called Q source That would be a source used by both Luke and Matthew. And the disciples are pictured as receiving a special grace. They are the ones who are getting an insight into the meaning of Jesus' parable. All right, the interpretation found beginning in verses 18 is according to an interpretation that we believe was made by the early church. This, by the way, is called allegorical. We have mentioned this before. That is, where each of the items within the parable have specific meanings, and therefore move beyond where the seed obviously is something that grows in the ground. Here becomes the word. So, and now we can see where this becomes an interpretive idea. To sow the word is a little different than to scatter the seed, but you could scatter the word, and that would be bringing it to many different peoples. Some also point out that this interpretation that is given here now has what we call, and always got to be careful here, an eschatological point of the parable. Namely, that when interpreted this way, it tends to look at an understanding in the future. Yes, something in the present, but also significantly something that will happen in the future. So, what is the allegorical interpretation here? Namely, that there are 4 types of hearers of the word, and the obstacles that the hearer or the farmer would face. So here, birds, a deficient understanding; rocks, the work of the evil one; thorns, lack of rootedness. When tribulation or persecution on account of the word comes, worldly concerns, lure of riches, all these stand in the way of God's word taking deep root and bearing fruit. So you see, what happens here is that we're not so concerned now with the actual growth of a plot of the wheat or whatever the seed was that was sown, but here how the word of God is sown, and how in the life of the hearer it might take effect. It might fall on hard ground and just bounce off. It might grow on rocky ground, take some root, but doesn't, when things happen, doesn't have enough moisture, doesn't have enough impetus to continue. So that's the way in which what we call a second interpretation, which probably would not have been an interpretation that Jesus gave to this parable, but rather one that was given by the early church, and which is, now when we say early church, keep in mind that it is not a universal church, but it is a particular community, and might very well be the community that Matthew represented, although by the time that this gospel is written and this interpretation is included, may have been also used by other Christian communities throughout the world, Mediterranean world of the time. That we can only guess at and make some conclusions. With that in mind, let's take a moment to look at the first reading, which comes again from the famous prophet that we often find is used as a source of inspiration by the early church, namely the prophet Isaiah. And as we have mentioned on a number of occasions, there really are 3 different sections to the book of Isaiah. This one comes from the chapter 55, which is the epilogue to 2nd Isaiah. See, and therefore, after chapter 55, there are 10 more verses that move now Isaiah forward. Remember what we say: first Isaiah, before the exile, second Isaiah during the exile, and third Isaiah after the exile. Simply here, this little choice that we hear this time shows the power of God's creative word. God's word, as the prophet sees it, is mysterious. It is an invisible force that still baffles people. And the analogy here is taken certainly from the idea of creation. God's word is like the rain that gently, or the snow that comes down out of the heavens, that waters the earth, makes it fertile, and then returns to the heavens after it has accomplished its purpose. So you can see the imagery here nicely helps interpret in its own way, from our point of view, the gospel parable. So the rain comes down, or snow, although snow in Israel does happen, but is not the kind of snow that we would be familiar with here in the northeastern, or certainly in the Buffalo area. But it comes down, does its job, waters the ground, and nurtures it, and then returns. So you see the secular effect of nature. And so this is a kind of interesting analogy here, cause and effect. So the cause is the water, the effect is the nurturing of the soil, the growth of things that come into being. So God's word, therefore, also, from the viewpoint that this is interpreted, is consistent and reliable, and human beings need to be totally dependent on it. Just as, and again, when it goes back to the nature analogy here, the seed and the soil are dependent on the rain in order to be able to produce. Without it, it would not, obviously, you don't have to be an expert here to see how all of this would work. So God's word is life-giving, nurturing, and Isaiah originally hopes his community will be inspired by this. They have listened very carefully to the words which preceded these verses, and now will take them to heart. So again, one finds here what we would call a little extended metaphor on the part of the prophet Isaiah. So parables are really the kind of source here for our consideration during these times. Since we have a little bit of time left here, let's review again the whole nature of a parable, why they were popular and how they were used. First of all, a parable often is a story that is drawn, you remember, from real life. So whatever the material is used is something that the audience would be familiar with. So as we mentioned at the beginning today, certainly people were familiar with how sowing of seed took place. You didn't have to be a farmer to know this, although certainly when we think about it, that 90% or so of people living in the territory of Jesus' time made their living by farming, were pretty much familiar with how farming took place and how sowing of seed took place. So that's where a good parable begins. We've noticed this in other parables that are used throughout the gospel tradition, but here to make mention of it. Secondly, usually when people listen to a parable, they noticed that the way things worked and that there was pretty much a normal pattern that was followed. Good parables often were colorful. In other words, like a good story, the audience kind of got it. So as we mentioned with this one, well, who is the sower? know something about the sower's background, or we don't. But there's a little, and by the way, leaves a little room for imagination. See, a good parable tells the story, but the hearer kind of can say, oh, well, I or we kind of can fill this in. And that's why parables could be told again and again, because often the way in which a parable was understood or interpreted would be determined by the situation of the audience or the hearer himself or herself. Then there is something extraordinary that is brought into the parable. And finally, as I mentioned earlier in our discussion today, good parables would end with often a question. In other words, the idea of a good parable was to throw the message that's being told here back into the hands or into the ears or into the heart or into the lives of the audience. Now, the fact here that something extraordinary happens, is certainly we've mentioned before, is that the produce from the sown seed is 100, 60, or 30. Would have caught the imagination of the audience. Wow, what kind of seed is this? What kind of soil allows this to happen? How could this be possible? So, in that sense, by giving these numbers, which were extraordinary in their own way, as we've mentioned, raised questions by the hearer, from the hearer rather, as to what exactly is at work here. See? So you can kind of smile and say, well, we would like to get some of this seed, if it's going to be that productive, when it falls and how it works. Or we need to examine and know where we can get this kind of soil in order for this to work. Or we need to be very careful to watch where the seed is placed. And I don't know that they went out and rooted out thistles, but they certainly would be very careful where they sowed this. So you see, in a certain way, the questions here raised by the parable are kind of interesting. Now, just in conclusion here a little bit, as we have mentioned a number of times that Matthew is very indebted often to material that is found in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. He pictures Jesus as a good teacher, and this idea of the seed producing so much might have been drawn from the book of Sirach. Again, in this book, particularly in chapter 41, in verse 4, the writer of the book of Sirach, remember that Sirach is part of what we call the wisdom tradition, and therefore would have been a popular kind of literature at work during the first century time. It was written somewhere between the years 100 or even 60, so going downward, remember, as time went. But in the book of Sirach, it says that a person hearing the word or this might receive 1,000, 100, or 10. So you see, this exaggeration that Matthew uses may have been built on something that Sirach had in mind. Now, don't think that Sirach had in mind seed, but had in mind more the word, and so you get this interpretation. And again, just to mention, as we bring to an end this time our discussion, I know we've had to kind of notice that there's not a whole lot of difficulty in interpreting this, but to see the variety of ways in which people could interpret this, and how later thinkers, looking at this little section from Matthew's Gospel, choose to interpret If there's a second interpretation that Matthew gives, they give interpretation too. And you can read writers like Augustine and Ambrose and others who also play around and take interpretation here as how the power of God's word works. Well, all of that concludes our look at the parable for this time. And in our next discussion, we will see that there are a couple other parables that are included here that Jesus uses. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.